So I'm going to sit among the panelists because we were supposed to have a journalist to run this, and we're going to run it ourselves in pure open source fashion. And we've identified 4 or 5 issues. The first one to run a global community is probably that a global community could be an oxymoron. Since community is about relationship, is about bonding, about sharing things that are maybe psychological, maybe from the realm of values, of ethics, or geography, it's probably very difficult to share these sort of things across the world. And some of the issues we've had are relate to language, to running face-to-face meetings, to having people participate in real-time meetings with different time zones. And we also have the issue of having communities or people participating in communities from areas where the purchasing power is so different that they can't travel the same way, and it's really not the same perspective or the same perception of society and their role in communities. Maybe we can touch first on the issue of languages, and who wants to jump in? That's yours.
I can start on that. I actually also want to follow up very briefly on the points that Mike raised, because I think they're extraordinarily important. And it has to do with the sustainability of an open source community. And it has a lot to do with how people relate to the product. As long as people consider it a product, a commodity, they won't really contribute back to that which is making it. They won't sustain it. They'll just take it. And so getting it sustained is extremely important. Now, doing that means speaking the language of the people who are using it, because you want to make this part of their environment, part of their activity. Then the problem is, how do you get them to speak the language that everyone in the world is speaking? What we did in Open Office, we require technical development work to be in English. I actually wanted French, but anyway. It has to be in English. But we also set up local communities in native languages. So people who have uncertainty or doubt or just need to know more can talk to each other in their native language. But when they contribute globally, they use English.
Thanks. Bertrand? Yes.
I think, so this is the external view on, between the open source project and the users. I'd like to speak a bit on the internal view because, for example, I'm the only board member at Apache who's not a native English speaker, and this is often hard. Those folks are making jokes, and I'm not getting them. Or we're having the monthly conference call, and we have an IRC back channel, and I'm asking all kinds of silly questions on the back channel. What does it mean? An expression from the US that I don't get. And I would encourage people to just jump in and don't be afraid of making mistakes. Sometimes people say, no, I cannot participate because my English is not good enough. Just do it. I mean, just communicate in the way you can. And people are usually very welcoming. Sometimes in our communities, we are too rude with newbies on a technical point of view. But on a language view, I've never seen someone, say your English is too weak to be here. Just jump in and stay simple, and it usually works. But that's a definite challenge.
Yes, OW2 has been running for 3 years without one single person whose native language was English. This first person joined, and I can see him in the room here, and we literally speak Globish, some kind of English and weak English, but actually that raises an issue for us and for all the non-English speaking countries. We realize that many of our members don't write blogs, don't communicate, and that the whole blogosphere is totally dominated by English-speaking writers, and it's something that really keeps all Brazil, most of Europe, and some China completely in the dark.
The one exception I can think of to that rule is, at least for Eclipse, there is a German community out there that talks in German about Eclipse quite a bit, but that's more the exception than the rule, I would say.
The one thing that actually breaks that rule is Twitter. It turns out that globally there are many local language Twitter communities, and with a decent Twitter client rather than the web interface, you can translate messages and you can add into your list of friends people who don't share English as their first language or don't share French as their first language, and on the occasions they're rude enough to use their own language, you can translate the message. And I found that it's a very effective way of growing the circle of people who I'm working with, is to subscribe to people who have other Twitter languages, as long as your client supports it.
Actually, I would second that and point an anecdote. One of the times I went to Japan to develop the local community there, it turned out that everyone wanted to speak English, which is great for me. I don't speak Japanese, but it took a long time. And so at some point, I just said, forget this, let's just use IRC. And so we were sitting on the table, 2 inches away from each other on IRC clients, going really fast, because writing was much easier than talking. And it also eliminated a lot of the uncertainty that we would otherwise have. And Twitter is just an extension of this. If you can write quickly, you can communicate using English if you have to use English.
So that, to push things along a little here, actually, Cedric, I think that highlights a different set of problems when it comes to open communities, particularly on a global basis. The communication ethos of many of the communities that I'm aware of is one that is driven by a male, slightly aggressive, slightly humor impaired, slightly obsessive mindset. And absolutely, sorry. And the consequence of that is that there are a number of groups of people who may well feel alienated in that. The one that most obviously arises in Western open source conferences is there are many fewer women involved in open source. But it also affects, for example, Japanese interaction with open source communities, where Japanese people find it harder to engage in that confrontational, aggressive way. And it also leads to, in countries such as India or China, where the cultural style makes people pull back from that. I wonder if any communities have got any experience of enabling those groups of people to engage.
It's slightly in humor, but don't forget, Eclipse originally was from IBM, and then they created an independent foundation. So originally the culture of Eclipse, if you will, was an IBM culture, never mind a national culture.
Yes.
My God, that was boring. I actually spent a year trying to stir controversy on the mailing list so that people would stop talking to each other in a monotone. So it's a slightly different problem, but it's culturally related.
I would say, I think in Apache we have the opposite origins. It started by a community of hackers from the US, mostly California, I think, and it can be very rude on some mailing lists. And I think that the solution, part of the solution for that is just express yourself. It's not my style to be rude, and if someone is rude, I just tell them in a respectful way. There's no need to be rude like that. You could just express the thing normally, and after a while, some people do get it after a while.
I would just actually return back to what Mike's point that he made, which is, to some extent, my experience has been that it has a lot less to do with whatever we conceive of as a cultural difference. I was in India once, and these developers stopped me and said, look, we're just dudes. I said, okay. It has a lot more to do with a way in which people understand the product that they are using and the way in which they see themselves as able to contribute to the making of that product. And that's the crucial point here. Every locality, whether it's tiny, whether it's big, it's going to be different. Paris is different from Lyon. It's different everywhere. And every different place really is responsible for coming up with its own way of understanding contribution and its own way of understanding how to make this sustainable. Because what it comes down to is very simple. If the users don't contribute, it's not sustainable. It will go away.
I was just going to close by, I think we're probably getting to the end of this topic, but just to say that, as you might have noticed, none of us have a perfect solution to this problem. We all struggle with it every day. I think that we all represent communities that have a lot of well-meaning people in it that are trying to be as welcoming as they possibly can. But the point is always that to have an open source community, you have to have something to talk about, and that thing that they talk about is ultimately most likely code, right? That's where the thing starts, and if you can meaningfully contribute to the code, doesn't matter what language you're speaking, if you're a meaningful contributor, ultimately you're going to be welcomed by the community.
Thank you. Another issue. Talking in English is one thing that is going to be difficult, and to W2 we kind of tend to solve this, or we find that one solution is not to have telephone meetings, but to have IRC. And to use IRC allows people to think about it and to express themselves without the fear of their accents. And I think this is something that is very useful. But another thing is not just about talking electronically. Another issue we found, and you probably have you've had to handle, is how to organize face-to-face meetings. Because bonding virtually over the internet is one thing, but drinking a beer together is totally different, and the experience is totally different, and putting a face on a name or a face on somebody's RSC pseudo is something different. How do you handle that?
I actually think that's one thing we do pretty well at Eclipse. So we actually have, I guess, I classify it as three different types of face-to-face meetings. So we have two conferences that we run every year. There's EclipseCon in California, Eclipse Summit Europe, normally held in Germany. And those are our two major gatherings of the community. So one in Europe and one in the US. Then we also have Eclipse Days, which are organized locally. So it's not organized by the Eclipse Foundation. We help market it, we help raise awareness, but it's somebody in the local community that says, you know what, I think I can get 100 people out in Cologne to talk about Eclipse and insurance. Right, that was a recent one we had. So those are Eclipse Days, locally organized. And then the last one are demo camps. We run 2 series of demo camps every year, one in the spring and one in the fall. Those are wildly successful, and it costs us, I think we chip in, Eclipse Foundation chips in $200 for pizza and beer, which depending on which locale you're in can be a lot of money or not a lot of money. But it's, and it really spurs the community, and every time we run one of those, I think now we're up to basically 35 demo camps around the world, including great representation from Asian countries where they get together and they're obviously talking in their own language. No one from the Eclipse Foundation even shows up, usually. Totally locally organized, but a great way to foster a feeling of local community.
Cedric's point is very important, because when we were setting up Open Office, the idea was just to do language-based communities, not regional. And you need that. You need the regional base to complement the language one. And so what I've been doing in Open Office is setting up these multiple regional communities with very low effort on the part of the people setting it up. All they have to do is tell us they're doing it. That's all. We give them some suggestions of how to set it up, what they have to consider, but they can add it, they can ignore it. They just have to tell us, and they have to essentially understand what our basic message is as a community and as a product and as an effort. And this allows people to get to know each other.
Yeah, fostering a sense of community. And by the way, my shameless plug for the day, there's an Eclipse Day in Paris on November 5th. Check our website.
Yeah. Yes.
In Apache, we have similar ways of organizing meetings. I just want to make an observation about the importance of face-to-face meetings. I don't need many face-to-face meetings, but I like to meet the person once. The people that I'm working with, I like to meet them at least once. You have dinner together or something, and you get a feel for the person. And it never happened to me that the person was less nice in real life than the impression I had of them by email. It's always, people are always nicer when I meet them than the impression I had of them by email. There's something to do with written communication and stuff. So I think it's really important to meet.
Well, and that I think that niceness is sticky. And what I mean by that is once you meet somebody, the next time they're going to flame you on the email, they'll ratchet it down just a little bit.
Or apologize.
That's right.
Yeah, sorry for calling you a jerk, but...
Oh, this is very important. We can't run a community without this kind of face-to-face meetings, and we tend to organize an annual conference at least once a year. This is very important. I think the other way to run this is also to organize, as you mentioned, with we do local chapters that allow people to organize by themselves and to get the ownership of the community project and to implement it their own way. Now, there is another thing, because we not only have the face-to-face meetings, but we have this kind of conferences. How do you handle the problem of real-time interaction? We've been with this conference calls where we have people in China, in Europe, in Brazil, and on the east and west coast of North America, and we have the odd guy who gets the 3 o'clock call in the morning, and I think this is very tough for that person, and I don't want to change the time for that.
Apache is designed to not need any real-time interaction. So we have a monthly board meeting, which is a conference call, and I think that's the only thing that's needed for us to operate.
Yeah, ditto for Eclipse. We have monthly board calls. Actually, once a quarter or thereabouts, we get together face-to-face just for the board. But there's councils that get together once a quarter, I think, on a phone call. But all of the project interactions, one thing that's a little bit weird about Eclipse, I know Apache uses the mailing lists, but we use Bugzilla. If you want to know what's going on at Eclipse, all the interesting conversations are happening in Bugzilla. And part of the reason why that is, it's nicely searchable and you can see the entire conversation over time. So that's actually it's ingrained in the Eclipse culture, that's where the conversations happen. And that takes it out of real time. And gives a way for people to interact slowly over time, but cycle the conversation into a consensus.
To follow up on what Mike is saying here and why it's important. No. Okay. It's important to have an accountable record of any meaningful discussion like that, so that precisely people who are not immediately awake at that hour at 3 in the morning their time can participate in the conversation at some later point. Now, this doesn't mean that it's not going to be the case that some people just get on IM together at whatever hour and blaze through whatever problems. But it does mean that for any substantial discussion that other people are going to be affected by, they have to have some sort of trace, IRC, IM, that is written, something that allows a trace for people to capture and follow up what's been discussed.
So conference calls are a toxic evil that are the result of a failure of all other means of the community working together. Yeah, totally. And if you find you have many conference calls, it means your community is failing and you should do something about it. One of the great ways of fixing it is to give everyone on the call the freedom to pick the time of one meeting in the cycle. And that means everybody has to stay up until 3 a.m. at some point. And there is nothing like being on a call at 3 a.m. to help you understand what a toxic evil conference calls are. The second way to do it is, as Lewis suggests, to keep rigorous minutes. And there is nothing like being the minute keeper to help you understand what a toxic evil telephone calls are. Ultimately, an open source community is about some code. And the interaction, the code talks. If you're doing the talking, probably you're not doing any of the coding. So the code talks, IRC talks, email works, conference calls are what you do when everything else is failing, or when there is something so fluffy that you don't know how to get your arms around it.
I can just add something. So I said that in Apache, the only regular conference call is a board call, monthly board call, and even this is designed to be prepared in advance. So we have the agenda in Subversion. It's a simple text file. So the complete agenda is ready before the meeting. All the questions are here, as many answers as possible, and this allows us to have a very efficient and quick meeting because we want to, go back to bed.
Yes, what we realize is the only way to really work globally is to work in an asynchronous way, so that people can just pick up the conversation at the time that is right for them, with some sort of written record that everyone can witness, and so they can be really transparent.
Around work items as well. If you've got work items, if you have a schedule, if you have a focus for activity, you probably don't need to be talking about it. you can probably do it on email or IRC or instant messaging or on
I don't know.
on a Bugzilla.
I think at some point a good telephone call can solve lots of things.
There are ultimately times when you do need a phone call, just as there are ultimately times when you need a face-to-face meeting. But too many times, in too many places in my career, have I seen the ultimate mechanism of bad management and project failure be expressed by the recurrence of telephone conference calls. And if you find your calendar is full of them, you are in a failing organization.
That basically means that every large corporation I've ever worked with or for is failing.
I thought I would leave you to pick that up as a conclusion.
I just thought I'd finish your thought for you.
But exactly, and probably to conclude, I think the challenges we're facing and the solutions we have to find, which has to be very low budget, make us very, very efficient. And I think lots of private corporations can learn a lot from the way we run these communities.
Well, the way I think about it, and part of the reason why I really wanted to get into open source when I took this role, is I actually think that open source communities are blazing the way for how people are going to be interacting in the future in their professional and personal lives. As we all know, the internet is getting more and more a social and media and entertainment channel. And what open source communities are doing is showing how you can do incredibly useful and vital work over the internet. And I think that a lot of corporations could learn organizational lessons from just observing how open source communities are so successful in getting stuff done without having conference calls ad nauseum.
Okay, that's all from me. Any other comments? I'm going to start there. Thank you very much. This is a topic for the next Open World Forum. And
this is a topic best had over beer.
Yes.
Over beer, exactly.
This is the old conflict between GPL and BSD, just so you know.
Okay, well, thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you.